Welcome to 35 West. I'm Chris Hernandez-Roy, Deputy Director of the Americas Program at CSIS and co-host of the 35 West podcast.
With how professional the Mexican government.
Are we ready? I don't think.
Reform trends in Argentina.
Right. And that's what happened.
Role at all in the NAFTA negotiations.
Welcome to 35 West. I'm Chris Hernandez-Roy, Senior Fellow and Deputy Director with the Americas Program at CSIS and the co-host of the 35 West podcast. Since it blatantly stole the July 28th presidential election, the Maduro regime in Venezuela has sought to repress its way out of mass protests demanding political change. The results of this strategy have been dire for human rights and civil liberties across the country, with human rights organizations reporting over 2,000 arbitrary detentions by government security forces since the election, while 24 people have been killed in the protests. The regime's heavy-handed crackdown comes at a time when the International Criminal Court has been investigating Venezuela for alleged crimes against humanity. Maduro and several members of his inner circle are presumed to be under investigation by the court, stemming from their role in previous rounds of arbitrary detentions, forced disappearances, torture, and murder conducted to repress the massive protests of 2014, 2017, and thereafter. The court now has the most recent repressive acts to investigate as well. As Maduro seeks to silence dissent and close the civic space, this pending case represents one of the few remaining levers the international community can apply to instill restraint and apply pressure on the regime, but only if such an approach is carefully considered. To help us unpack the state of the current ICC case against Maduro and shed some light as to where the situation in Venezuela might evolve from here, we're honored to be joined today by Santiago Canton, Secretary General of the International Commission of Jurists and a member of the panel of independent international experts on the possible commission of crime against humanity in Venezuela of the Organization of American States. Thank you for joining us today, Santiago.
Thank you very much, Luis, for the invitation. I'm glad to be back in contact with you to talk about Venezuela.
Before we get into the current state of events on the ground, can you give us a little bit of the history of the ICC investigation? You and I both worked on the OAS process to investigate the possible commission of crimes against humanity in Venezuela, which led directly to the Article 14 referral of the country to the court by 6 member states of the Rome Statute back in 2018. That was the first such referral in the court's history. The ICC prosecutor then formally opened an investigation in November of 2021. What happened in Venezuela during those years that led the ICC to open an investigation? And what steps or process did the ICC have to take to reach the historic decision to open an investigation?
Before I start to answer, let me clarify one thing for the audience. This is a very complex situation, a complex issue with very complicated, sometimes legal terms. I will try to explain it in a very simple way rather than using the technical words that we lawyers like to use. So, if you go back to 2016, 17, 18, you may remember, Chris, that almost every institution, whether from civil society or from multilateral organizations, from Venezuela and from all over the world, had unanimously say that there were human rights violations in Venezuela. Going back to the International Commission of Human Rights, which is the regional body to supervise human rights in the region, who had like 3 or 4 reports denouncing human rights violations. And then you have the UN, even the Secretary General had a statement about the situation of human rights violation in Venezuela, the High Commissioner of Human Rights of the UN system, almost every what is called special mechanism of the UN, all the different rapporteurs and the different institutions they have internally at the UN, they all have stated back in 2016, 17, and 18 that there were human rights violations. Now, the issue became whether or not those human rights violations constituted crimes against humanity. And there is a difference there. The difference is that today in the world, for the last 2 decades, we have the International Criminal Court, and the International Criminal Court has its own, let's call it, criminal code or penal code. And that code is the Rome Statute. And in the Rome Statute, there are certain violations which constitute crimes against humanity, which is different from just human rights violations. They have certain specificities, which I'm not going to get into it. But if there are crimes against humanity, the International Criminal Court has jurisdiction. So the situation we were confronted back in 2018 was whether or not there were crimes against humanity in Venezuela, so the International Criminal Court can activate its jurisdiction over Venezuela. And that's when the former ICC prosecutor Luis Moreno Ocampo and the Secretary General of the OAS got together back then with your support to say, okay, let's investigate if what everybody is calling human rights violations are already crimes against humanity and the International Criminal Court has to act. So we did several hearings during 2 weeks in Washington, D.C., in the Hall of the Americas of the OAS, which is a very traditional institution in Washington, D.C. And we got testimonies from 100 witnesses or 200, but basically we got very clear information of what was going on in Venezuela. And in addition to that, we asked several NGOs from all over the world to send us information about what was going on in Venezuela. We collect all that information with the support of the OAS Secretariat, and Almagro and Luis Moreno Ocampo created this panel of experts, which I am a member, together with Irwin Cutler from Canada and Manuel Ventura from Costa Rica. We reviewed all that information, and we concluded that there was already reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela at that time, again 2018, and the ICC should act. So that was the background of what's going on right now. And we produced a report, and we presented that report in person to the ICC prosecutor in The Hague. And in addition to that, we did something which was groundbreaking. We convinced 6 countries to present that report and that complaint about crimes against humanity in Venezuela also to the ICC. We did it. The Secretary General of the OAS presented to the prosecutor, but we managed to get 6 countries supporting that referral. And that was extremely important because it does give procedural benefit. Basically, the prosecutor did have to open the investigation at some point, and we knew that was going to happen. And that happened in 2021, as you said. And that started the process way too long. I mean, we are critical about how long it's taken. But in the world today, in which every international institution, whether it is the OAS, whether it is the European Commission, the European Union, almost every government has criticized Venezuela. At the time, the UN has criticized Venezuela, as I said, all the mechanisms of the UN Secretary General. So everybody so far play the role. What's missing is the prosecutor to charge someone of the Maduro regime, and that could imply sending someone to jail in The Hague or in any other country. So that's the only piece that is missing, the prosecutor charging someone in Venezuela.
One of the things that you and the rest of the panel, and I expect the prosecutor must have concluded from all this research and all this evidence that was gathered, because it's part of one of the elements that's needed to conclude that crimes against humanity have been committed, is that the crimes that are being committed, the attack, is part of a widespread pattern against a defined population, in this case, the opposition, or people perceived to be part of the opposition. So there was at least an initial finding that widespread and systematic attack under a plan from the government was in fact taking place. So that's actually really important to keep in mind.
Right. Yeah. If I may, Chris, exactly. I mean, basically, the Rome Statute, this criminal code, talks about, as you said, widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population with the knowledge that that's part of the attack. So that's basically the criteria you need to prove. And we proved that in the report. And let me just briefly say what were the crimes that we identified. Several crimes, but the most important ones. Crime of torture, thousands of cases. Still going on. The crime of arbitrary detention, basically sending people to jail and keeping there for a long term. The crime of political persecution, that was also something that we identified. The crime of executions, judicial executions, that's the technical term. We also identified that. And we are talking about the thousands. We also the crime of rape. So that was the information we sent to the prosecutor in The Hague.
Since the court opened an investigation, how much progress has it made to gather evidence into the alleged crimes being committed in Venezuela? And has the government placed obstacles in the way of the ICC's investigation?
Let me start with the second one, which is more clear, the answer. Absolutely. The government of Venezuela has tried to use every possible tool they have to block the ICC to do their work. presenting different requests to the ICC to stop the investigation. They appointed an ambassador specifically in The Hague to, quote unquote, lobby the ICC. So they really are spending millions to try to stop the prosecutor to act. As we know from many people internally from the government, the only thing they fear right now, Maduro and his group, is the ICC, because the possibility that they may end up in jail in The Hague. Now, has the prosecutor done all their job? There's not much information about that. We hope so. We know that the process has moved forward, not at the pace that we want, but it did move forward. And we are at the stage in which at any time the prosecutor can charge Maduro or someone from that regime. So that's the stage we are in. So there has been progress, way too slow, but there has been progress.
You mentioned that you found, and presumably the court has found, evidence of torture, of arbitrary detention, murder, among other crimes. And I suspect these will be the charges brought against anyone who is eventually, as you just said, indicted or arrested. But how wide a net might the court cast? Who in fact, perhaps beyond Maduro, who in fact could possibly be indicted or have arrest warrants issued for them?
Let me just, for the audience, they have to think about the ICC, International Criminal Court, although it is international and it has many differences. It is like any tribunal at the local level in any country. Basically, you have a judge, you have a prosecutor, you have a judge, and you have the defendant. So that's the way it works. Now, the prosecutor can basically charge anybody, but has to be someone that they can connect to a specific crime. So right now, that's the stage we are in. Before we were in a more general stage. You have to show that there is this widespread or systematic attack against the civilian population. Now we are at the stage in which we have to prove, and the prosecutor has to prove, that whether Maduro or someone else from the regime is connected to a specific crime. Let's say they torture someone, okay, who tortured and who gave the order? So if it was Maduro, he can charge Maduro. If it was not Maduro and was the general in charge of torture, let's put it that way, he should charge that general. So that's the stage we are in. We all believe that Maduro should be charged, and many other people in the government as well. That's what we believe based on the information we collected. But again, it's up to the prosecutor to decide where and who should he start to charge members of the regime.
So let's bring the clock forward to today. In light of the massive repression unfolding since the stolen July 28th election, is that going to complicate the ICC's task, given that there's a whole new wave of repression? Will evidence around these new crimes also be investigated before the court issues arrest warrants, possibly delaying the process? Or do you think the court has enough evidence based on the past crimes that it could speedily move towards issuing arrest warrants?
Right. It should not at all delay the process, and it has the potential to speed up the process to some extent. Why? Because there's no need that he charge someone that is acting today based on what happened after July 28th. The prosecutor can charge someone that committed an act of torture or murdered someone 8 years ago. Basically, what happened after July 28th, the window, it opens up even more. So there are more people that he can charge. Of course, for the latest cases, going back to July 28th, probably he has not been able to conduct a thorough investigation of those cases yet. He probably has more information about the past cases because we, plus many NGOs from all over the world, had sent the prosecutor specific information. So definitely he has information to accuse someone, whether it's from what happened now or before.
You've already mentioned that there are calls by the international community to issue arrest warrants. And notably, just a couple of weeks ago, the European Parliament passed a resolution asking for the ICC to do just that. Now, beyond the question of upholding international law and bringing justice to the perpetrators of the crimes in Venezuela, would an ICC indictment or arrest warrant make it less likely for top regime officials to leave power in some sort of hypothetical negotiation? Or would an indictment make Maduro and whoever else is indicted, would it make them hold on even more forcefully to power, knowing that they would otherwise wind up in a jail in The Hague?
Let me start, Chris, by saying that we are in a situation right now If we look at Nicaragua, Cuba, of course, we are in a situation in which the regime may try, and is trying to do that, to stay on for the next decades. I mean, that's basically the path this situation is unfortunately taking. And we do have experiences in Latin America showing that they can do that. Now, and the international community, as I said at the beginning, has tried every tool we have, with one exception, this one, the ICC, and charging someone. That's why I'm saying it is critical. It is critical. We will talk about what may happen, but regardless of that, it is critical because it's the only thing that we have at this stage that has not been proved already. So that's why we insist that the prosecutor must act, has the potential to be a game changer. Right now, we don't have anything like that could have a game changer. So that's why we insist that the prosecutor should act. Now, what could happen? Of course, no system, whether it's international or national, is perfect. There are always problems. And one of the problems with the international community, whether it's ICC or any other judicial or quasi-international body, you have to detain someone. If the person doesn't leave the country, you cannot detain that person. Even if the prosecutor charged Maduro, and Maduro decides to stay in Venezuela the rest of his life, there's nothing you can do, right? I mean, you cannot get into the country, capture him. And although it has happened in history, that's not something that we would recommend. But at the same time, he will be imprisoned in his own country, basically. He will not be able to get outside of Venezuela. But in addition to that, a charge against Maduro or any other member of administration will definitely create internal problems. No general of Venezuela probably likes to be indicted by the ICC. They probably don't want to be stuck in Venezuela for the rest of their life. Their children, their wives probably want to move out of Venezuela at some point. So it will start to create internal problems. And that's why it's so important that the prosecutor acts. Again, this is the only tool left we have in our toolbox.
Well, I was just going to anticipate with my next question what you've just said in terms of, do arrest warrants then maybe get second tier or slightly lower level, but still very important officials that are at least carrying out the regime's orders? Does it get them to second guess whether they should be following those orders, especially ones that haven't been indicted, but seeing that their superiors have been indicted? And does it create fissures in the regime that the opposition could possibly exploit?
Right, exactly. And that's exactly what I think. If the prosecutor charged someone, not necessarily Maduro, someone, it will start to have all those implications. Someone will say, hey, why me and not all of you that also have been doing the same thing that I've been doing? And you are going to give me into them? No. That political turmoil may happen if the prosecutor decides to charge someone, whether it's Maduro or someone else.
I want to sort of exploit your background as a jurist a little bit further, to look at maybe even more remote, but still other possibilities, other legal possibilities or legal options to hold the regime to account. The principle of universal jurisdiction has been used in the past to arrest individuals accused of international crimes. Perhaps the most famous case is that of Augusto Pinochet, who was arrested in London 2 decades ago, I believe, at the request of a Spanish judge for alleged crimes committed against Spanish citizens by the dictatorship in Chile. Very recently, the government in your home country, Argentina, charged Maduro with crimes against humanity under Argentine law and issued a red notice to Interpol requesting that law enforcement worldwide arrest Maduro should he travel outside the country, which you just said he would be prisoner in his own country. But if there wasn't an ICC warrant and he decided to go travel, Venezuela responded issuing its own sort of absurd arrest warrant for Argentine President Javier Milei. But in your opinion, what are chances that universal jurisdiction could be applied in the Venezuelan case? And can you just briefly describe for our listeners also what universal jurisdiction is?
Right. Basically, it became popular, as you said, with the case of Pinochet. Basically, some countries have it in the constitution, as it is the case of Argentina. Even though if they don't have it, they can apply it. Basically, they can use the regular justice system. Any judge, in this case Argentina, received the complaint from an international organization against Maduro, and they open the case as they would do with any other internal case that they have. So that's basically when we talk about the universal jurisdiction is, a local judge acting in cases that are not from that country, but they were presented to them from outside the country. That's a universal jurisdiction, and it has happened. I mean, if you look, it's not very well known, but right now France is the number one country in the world with cases of universal jurisdiction. They may have like 50 or 60 cases. I don't know how many they have. Argentina is second in that list of countries that have open cases of universal jurisdiction. This latest one is about Venezuela, but Argentina has also opened a case about the disappearances during the Franco regime in Spain. So there are different things that you can do under universal jurisdiction. Now, I think that's great. I think it's good. The idea here is fight against impunity. That's what we are doing with the ICC, with the universal jurisdiction, with all the international tribunals we have, is fighting against impunity and making sure that the worst killers, torturers, rapists, they go to jail. I mean, that's what we want to do when we talk about universal jurisdiction or any other system. Now, are they effective? As I said before, no system is perfect, but in the case of Pinochet, it did work. There are some other cases that has also worked. The people have been detained and sent to another countries, but it's not 100% sure that it will work. In the case of Argentina, again, as I said before, Maduro may decide, as he is doing, to stay in Venezuela and travel very little. And if they decide to travel, he will have to travel to Nicaragua or to Cuba or to Russia. But he doesn't have too many options. So it starts to get restricted. And of course, nobody wants to be in that situation.
Another mechanism that's used is transitional justice, at least for crimes that are not the most serious crimes, certainly not for crimes against humanity. And transitional justice has been applied in various countries around the world, specifically in sort of to end conflicts or in post-conflict situations, including in Latin America. And while it appears unlikely today, in the event of a political transition in Venezuela, how might a new government balance the desire for justice for abuses by the state with the need for social reconciliation?
That's always an issue that we've been dealing with in Latin America particularly, but other regions of the world as well. It's happening in Nepal, it happened in South Africa, of course, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, all the countries in the Inter-American system. And basically the idea is you want to have a democracy, you want to live in peace, but you have these people that were in power and committed these awful crimes. How do you balance those two things? How you can move forward and at the same time have a decent level of justice for the victims of the crimes committed by these past regimes. And there are many different ways of doing transitional justice. You have the experience of Peru, you have the experience of Argentina. Argentina is probably the most open one because basically right now, after transitional justice, they are prosecuting all the military officers that were part of the military regime. Then you have cases like Brazil that has not been able to prosecute anybody, but it did create a truth commission to look into what happened, so at least the victims have the truth of what happened to their loved ones. Or you have a mix, which is the case of Chile, for instance, which they also have a truth commission, and they also are prosecuting some individuals. And the most developed one in the region, and probably in the world right now, is the one in Colombia, which they created a special jurisdiction for the peace. And that special jurisdiction is prosecuting some of the members of the military, but also of the guerrilla movements. The beauty about transitional justice is that there's not one set model. Every country is choosing their own model. But the final idea is we cannot let these crimes go away without some sort of justice. And that's what transitional justice is all about. And again, has been extremely successful for at least, I would say, 30 years in many countries and regions of the world.
The United States is not a signatory of the Rome Statute. Therefore, it's not a member of the ICC, and has had a fraught relationship with the court, going so far as to sanction the former chief prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, in 2020 over the ICC's investigations into Afghanistan. Yet the State Department has provided funding to the International Center for the Prosecution of the Crime of Aggression against Ukraine, which was established in The Hague at Eurojust with the support of the European Commission. How could Washington support an investigation into crimes against humanity in Venezuela?
Let me start by saying that from a legal perspective, activist perspective, it's very unfortunate that the U.S. is not part of it. So it's not only the U.S., but many other countries that have not ratified the Rome Statute and they are not part of the system. That's very unfortunate. And we all hope that one day they will join the system. At the same time, I think it's important that they engage with the system. As you mentioned, they are doing. That's an important step forward. Now, the problem I see in this situation is that they should not engage when it's good for them. They should engage in a more consistent way with the system in spite of the fact they are not member of it. What can they do in the case of Venezuela? In all these institutions, by far the main problem is lack of funding. As simple as that. Even in the case of Venezuela, we know that the Office of the Prosecutor doesn't have enough staff to conduct all the investigations they need to do. So they can collaborate with the ICC in order to get the funding needed. But again, the US should engage with the ICC, but should not do it just when they find it convenient.
Santiago, there's also the question of international enforcement of any possible ICC arrest warrant against regime officials in Venezuela. This summer, Vladimir Putin, who has a standing arrest warrant from the court over child abductions in Ukraine, traveled to Rome Statute signatory Mongolia without any consequences. And a year earlier, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa asked the ICC for permission not to arrest Putin if he came to the 2023 BRICS summit in South Africa, because to do so, he said, would, quote, amount to a declaration of war. While Maduro is not the head of a nuclear superpower, do these episodes point to a crisis of legitimacy for the court?
I would say that there is a crisis of legitimacy of international systems in general, unfortunately, over the last decade or so. And that's one of the main challenges we have, from the human rights community. So it's not just only on this situation in particular. The system is not working perfectly. It's not working the way it should be working. But at the same time, there is a system and it's moving forward. And there are people in jail in The Hague and in other countries, not just only in The Hague, because of the actions of the ICC. Before this meeting, I checked, and there are approximately 60 people that have been indicted by the ICC in its history. I would say over a dozen people that have gone to jail because of the ICC actions. So there is hope. There is a possibility of doing it. It is difficult. In the cases you mentioned, traveling to Mongolia and nothing happened, that's true. But there are some places that he cannot travel. Same with Maduro. It's not the ideal situation, but it's better than the alternative, which is doing nothing.
Santiago, is there something we didn't cover? Anything you'd like to highlight or add?
The last question you asked, I think, is the most important one. We do have a crisis in the world today, a crisis where the international system as we know it, the one that was created after 1945, which created the most incredible advancement to protect the individuals, which is the system of human rights and now the ICC, it's been discussed. It's been discussed not in the right way. I mean, as you know very well, with the Inter-American system, they have been always attempts to limit their role, to undermine their capacity to do their work. The same is happening on a worldwide level with all these institutions, with the UN, with the Inter-American system, with the African system, and with the ICC. So we need more activists, we need more government activists to strengthen the system again. Otherwise, impunity wins.
Thanks for joining us on 35 West, Santiago. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. And that's it for this week's edition of 35 West. We hope you enjoyed listening and that you'll stay tuned for future episodes.